In 1914, Freud wrote a paper called The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement. Freud started the paper by saying that psychoanalysis is my creation. And he also says that no one can know better than him what psychoanalysis is. In this paper, Freud does acknowledge his mentor, Joseph Breuer, and his use of the cathartic procedure, which relies heavily on hypnosis. But Freud strongly says that the true genesis of psychoanalysis began when he stopped working with hypnosis and started using the method of free association. In the paper, Freud explains that he didn't change techniques just for experimentation or curiosity. He says that this technical change is what unlocked the unconscious. In 1890s, hypnosis was seen as a powerful method. A patient was put under hypnosis, and then their unconscious mind would be bypassed. And then they would reveal the cause of their symptoms. Hypnosis made the whole process seem very quick and efficient. Now, why would Freud give up a method that seemed to give him direct access to the patient's trauma? Because hypnosis bypasses the most crucial element of the mind, which is the patient's active resistance. Freud realized that under hypnosis, the patient isn't actually doing the work of integrating the repressed memory. Freud found that the cures achieved under hypnosis were often temporary. The symptoms would just migrate to another part of the body. And there was another problem too. Not everyone can be hypnotized. So for this reason, Freud started using free association by asking patients who are now fully awake, not hypnotized, to say everything that comes to mind, no matter how embarrassing, illogical, or irrelevant it may seem. However, Freud observed that when a patient is doing free association, patients always reach a point where they get stuck. They might say that the next thought is not important to say, or even get annoyed with the analyst. Freud realized that this resistance, this blockage, is the real clue. It shows that the mind is actively trying to keep something hidden. With this shift from hypnosis to free association, the new method becomes a conversation. In other words, a talking therapy, where the patient simply says everything that comes to mind. And with this change, Freud shows that psychoanalysis is built on free association, and it becomes its foundation. In this paper, Freud addresses that neurosis has a sexual origin. This theoretical position led to a professional rift with Joseph Breuer, who disagreed with Freud's conclusion. And Freud credited the core concepts of sexual etiology of neurosis to brief remarks made by three prominent 19th century doctors who later denied and ignored the very comments they had shared with Freud. Freud writes about taking a walk with Joseph Breuer in Vienna, and a man approaches Breuer to talk to him about his wife, who suffered from a nervous illness. After the conversation with the man, Breuer told young Freud that these things are always secrets of the marriage bed, and Freud is surprised as he is a young neurologist absorbing everything from his mentor, who casually revealed the primary cause of human neurosis. Freud identified Jean-Martin Charcot, the most famous neurologist in Europe at the time, as the second person to suggest the etiology of neurosis. While attending a party, Freud overheard Charcot excitedly telling a story about a patient with a nervous disorder. Charcot explained that the woman's husband was impotent, and he declared that such nervous problems always involve physical sexual issues. Freud was surprised by Charcot's admission. The young Freud wondered if Charcot was already aware of the causes of neurosis, why he never mentioned this information during his formal lectures. In this paper, Freud identified the third influential figure as Rudolf Grolbeck, a famous doctor in Vienna. Krobeck sent Freud a patient who suffered from severe anxiety because her husband had been impotent for 18 years. Krobeck privately told Freud that the only cure for her condition was something he couldn't legally prescribe. And he says this to Freud using a Latin phrase to hide the nature of his medical advice. By examining these three examples, Freud highlights a major inconsistency in the medical community of his time. He argues that leading scientists already understood the connection between repressed sexuality and mental illness, yet they refused to acknowledge it professionally. Instead of treating this knowledge as a serious scientific truth, they dismissed it as a private joke or a casual observation shared only in social settings. Freud portrays himself as a lone pioneer who followed a theory that others were too afraid to support. While Brewer, Charcot, and Krobeck recognized the connection between sexuality and neurosis, they were unwilling to acknowledge it publicly. Freud argues that although this influential man provided him the initial insight, he was the only one brave enough to face the social backlash of turning that observation into a formal scientific theory. In this paper, Freud argues that the medical community was afraid to accept the reality of his findings because Freud turned these controversial theories into a formal medical practice, and for this reason, he was rejected and excluded by the scientific establishment. Freud presented his findings on the sexual origin of neurosis to the Vienna Society for Psychiatry and Neurology, expecting a serious scientific discussion. However, his peers met his work with hostile silence rather than debate. This reaction led to his social isolation. People avoided him on the street, and his medical practice declined as he lost patient referrals. Freud eventually realized that his theories had deeply unsettled society's established beliefs. Freud described his professional rejection as splendid isolation, turning a negative situation into a productive one. He argued that being excluded was not a tragedy, but rather the environment that allowed him to make his greatest discoveries. Without the pressure to follow traditional medical views, he was free to observe and think independently. During this solitary time, he developed the core foundations of psychoanalysis, including repression, resistance, infantile sexuality, and dream interpretation. In this paper, Freud describes repression as the foundation of psychoanalysis. This process occurs when an instinctual urge comes into conflict with the moral or societal standards of the conscious mind. Instead of disappearing, it is pushed deep into the unconscious mind because its energy cannot be destroyed. The act of forcing an acceptable thought out of conscious awareness is what Freud defined as repression. Freud also mentions resistance in this paper, which is the energy used to keep repressed thoughts hidden and submerged. But when an analyst tries to bring any hidden memory to the surface, the patient's mind fights back. The patient might suddenly forget the thoughts, change the subject, or become very angry with the analyst to unconsciously avoid facing painful memories. In the second part of the paper, at around 1902, Freud says that his professional isolation began to end. A small group of young doctors gathered around him to learn and spread the practice of psychoanalysis. They held regular evening meetings at Freud's home, which eventually became the first psychoanalytic society. This group included important early collaborators like Otto Rank, as well as writers, artists, proving that psychoanalysis influenced fields beyond just medicine. From 1907, the movement received more attention thanks to the support of Eugene Bleuler and Carl Jung in Zurich. Zurich became a major center for teaching and developing the field. Even though the leaders had disagreements, particularly regarding the importance of libido, the practice of psychoanalysis spread quickly to other countries. It impacted psychiatry and various other disciplines, continued to expand despite facing intense criticism and opposition. In this paper, Freud said that he chose not to respond publicly to most critics and rejected the claim that his work was merely a product of Viennese culture. Despite the ongoing opposition, supporters like Eugene Bleuler helped protect the movement, and psychoanalysis became a major framework for understanding the human mind. At around 1910, Freud tried to organize psychoanalysis into an official international movement, and he wanted to move its center to Zurich and placing Carl Jung as its leader, hoping to give it structural authority and protection as it grew. Freud wanted to pass the leadership of psychoanalysis to Carl Jung, even though Jung was already starting to disagree with some of Freud's theories. Freud felt old and tired, and he needed a young, brilliant leader after he's gone. Jung was an ideal choice because he held an independent academic position and did not rely solely on private medical practice like the doctors in Vienna. Freud later believed that this choice was a mistake. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytic Association was created to guide the practice, train doctors, and protect psychoanalysis from misuse, and it expanded through congresses, local groups across countries, and new journals that spread its ideas. However, internal conflicts, leadership problems, and disagreements increased, especially under Jung's presidency. While some members broke away from the movement, Freud came to see that just like patients resist difficult truths, analysts themselves could also reject or abandon psychoanalytic ideas when faced with strong inner resistance. Freud argues that psychoanalysis is not meant to explain all human behavior, and Alfred Adler and Carl Jung try to turn psychoanalysis into a complete system. Freud criticizes Adler for reducing everything to ego, self-assertion, and the will to power, while ignoring the role of libido, and Freud sees his theory as a distortion of psychoanalysis. Freud also criticizes Jung for moving away from instinct and sexuality, which, in Freud's opinion, made his theory vague and unclear. Freud concludes that both approaches, Adler and Jung, abandon the core principle of psychoanalysis and should not be considered part of it. In other words, Freud uses this paper to declare that Jung's new approach is not psychoanalysis. Freud ends his 1914 paper by saying that psychoanalysis will survive the loss of these members, meaning Adler and Jung, and will attract new followers. Freud concludes by wishing a pleasant journey to those who found the difficult work of psychoanalysis too uncomfortable. For those who remain, Freud hopes that they can continue their deep research into the human mind without any further interference.